look at your handout, it says from Babel to Canaan. This is the first of a four-part series on Abraham, and it'll be a chronological series of 4 Bible studies broken down into some of the highlights of Abraham's life and lessons we can learn from them. So what you'll see in part 2 will be Abraham from Canaan to Melchizedek. Part 3 will be lessons in faith and relationships. And part 4 will be Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, the supreme sacrifice. So again, I'll come back to those topic titles later, but today's title, again, from Babel to Canaan. Now, 10 generations passed from Adam to Noah. 10 generations, and idolatry and wickedness was widespread in Noah's day. God had preserved a remnant to serve him, a continuous line of patriarchs, starting with Adam, then Seth, then Enoch, then Methuselah, then Noah, and so forth. And the line of faithful people would continue through Noah's son Shem. So there would always be a continuous line of patriarchs that God would work with because they remained faithful. And as we know, when Noah was called by God to prepare an ark, only 8 people out of whatever the world's population was. We have no clear idea how many millions or billions were extant on the earth at the time of the flood. But only 8 people survived because God saw that Noah was righteous. May I? Oh, never mind. I have somebody left me a water. That's great. Thank you. Genesis 7, verse 1, in your notes, God declared that Noah was righteous in his generation. He says, "Come into the ark, you and your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." This implies that only Noah, out of all the people on earth, only Noah was faithful. This is the implication of that verse. So the flood waters rose 15 cubits, and that's estimated at about 23 feet above the highest peaks of mountains on earth. 15 feet above the highest peaks. We did a Bible study a couple of months ago about how geology is showing us how there could have been enough water to cover those peaks, and geological transformation of, like Mount Everest, 26,000 feet. Maybe it wasn't anywhere near that tall before the flood, and other great mountains around the world. And so there are different things that geology is discovering that push out all the naysayers and the scoffers that God's truth is preserved in the Bible. And if God said he covered all of the mountains 15 cubits higher than the highest peak, that's what he did. Then God directed humanity to repopulate the earth, and which the flood had swept away because of their evil, because of the wickedness, moral corruption throughout the world. Sadly, though, right after the flood, among the descendants of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, there soon developed the same apostasy all over again, the same corruption, the same disregard for God's laws, the same patterns as their ancestors before the flood. But still, a faithful seed would be preserved out of Shem's descendants, through whom God would fulfill tremendous promises that would affect humanity in through the millennium and beyond. Today's Bible study, again, is a narrative about Abraham's call to be separated from his people for a higher calling. Now, the descendants of Noah continued to dwell among the mountains where the ark had rested. Their numbers would increase. And after a time, though, the people who had no desire to retain God and their knowledge started separating from those believers of God. And some journeyed to the plain of Shinar. It says in your notes, Genesis 11, verses 1 through 4. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So they decided to build a city and a tower of such great and majestic height that the population would marvel and be awestruck by its size and their height. And their plan was for this city to be like a world empire, from what we can glean from the scriptures, and a tribute to mankind's magnificent achievements. This great tower would extend up into the heavens above, into the clouds, and they thought this would perpetuate their fame to all future generations. Well, the tower was partially completed, and the people were obviously rejoicing over the success they had so far. They were praising their gods of silver and gold, and suddenly their great plans came to a screeching halt. God came down to confuse their languages and frustrate this building project. Can you imagine a whole bunch of construction workers at any construction site that can speak the same language, and suddenly there's multiple languages among that group, and who knows how many people were working on this tower? Probably a lot of people. And they're all misunderstanding each other's languages. They're all confusing, and they can't continue the work. So you could see that a sudden stop in the construction, just based on God changing their languages. You wake up one morning, you have a different language than you did the day before, and yet your mind thinks in that new language as if nothing changed. You go up, you get up from your bed, you go into the kitchen, your kids are in the other room, their kids are speaking a different language, your wife can't understand a word you're saying. What a creepy thing must have happened to people that would be in those situations. Now, I don't know if each family connection had their own language that was, common between them. We don't know. But the whole population, there were multiple languages. Genesis 11, verses 5 through 9, in your notes. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, Indeed, the people are one, and they have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they purpose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. Some groups would go one way, another group would go this way, another group would go that way. And in the effort of such a wicked society to push God out of the picture and do things their own way, and to take pride in their own human accomplishments, ironically, that's exactly how God used the situation to repopulate the earth again. God works in mysterious ways. So many times we can see how God uses Satan when Satan does things to try to thwart God's plans, and God says, oh, you're working right into my plans here. Perfect. Whatever you're doing, Satan, I'm going to make something good out of it. This is the constant thing we will see even up until Christ's return. So anyway, let's continue. Sadly, as they established their groups, maybe groups would gather together that say, oh, you speak my language, come join us. And little groups would get together and spread across the earth. Now, Noah comes along. Well, he lives 350 years after the flood. So he lives through this whole situation. Shem, his son, lives 500 years after the flood. And so we can see that the family line carries along God's laws, statutes, and judgments. They were going to be passed down at least in one family line to their descendants. But the rest of humanity, they had no interest in retaining the knowledge of God. Romans 1 verses 20, in your notes, Paul gives a very brief history of humanity from these earliest generations. He says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things, statues and images of things that God created, and not the Creator himself." Verse 24, "Therefore God gave them up to uncleanness in their lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever and ever. Amen." Paul is pointing way back to the first generations when he makes this statement, and it hasn't changed since. The vast numbers of people in the world have a cloak over their eyes, immersed in paganism, and they believe that they're sincere in worshiping the same God you and I worship. But the vast numbers of people on earth are not worshiping the same God at all. So God used this method of also slowing down the digression, the progression of wickedness, and stretching out time in that sense. But from time to time, God's invisible hand would steer nations and governments on earth to hold back the speed of evil. And hence we're this many thousands of years removed from the Tower of Babel. Here's a lesson for us. The grand designs of tower builders in this day could end in defeat. In fact, they will when God comes with his wrath in the day of the Lord, day of God's vengeance, the year of God's recompense. Yet people in all generations have tried to go the same course as the people that left Babel, trying to live their own lives independent of God's laws. And that's the same principle at work that Satan used when he instigated war in heaven. He tried to do it his way and persuaded 1/3 of all the angels in heaven to follow him. That God's ways were harsh and demanding and restrictive. My ways are easier, just follow me. He was able to persuade a whole third of the angels to follow him. Very sad, but it's shocking, but God has revealed that to us. Psalm 73, verses 3 through 9 in your notes. It shows many seek independence from God, and they would rather glorify themselves in obtaining riches and glory and power. Asaph says in this psalm, Psalm 73, verses 3 through 9, "For I was envious of the boastful when I saw the prosperity of the wicked, for there are no pangs in their death, but their strength is firm. They're not in trouble as other men, nor are they plagued like other men. Therefore, pride serves as their necklace, violence covers them like a garment. Their eyes bulge in abundance. They have more than their heart could wish. They scoff and they speak wickedly concerning oppression. They speak loftily. They set their mouth against the heavens, and their tongue walks through the earth." So what Asaph is saying in the psalm is the proud may temporarily have power, great power and influence. And they may have success, but in the end they will only find disappointment and despair because it doesn't last forever. Now we come to the call of Abraham. So the people that were all collected together in Babel had scattered, but idolatry was still almost universal. God had stepped back from humanity for the most part, allowing them to run their evil ways. A few more generations passed until this one man, God noted, was faithful and would resist the constant pulls and temptations of the society he lived in. Now, Abraham came out of Babylon, Ur of the Chaldees, the Chaldean Empire, the Babylonian Empire, same thing. So he chose Abram, and I'm going to interchange a little bit, Abraham and Abram, but he's first called Abram, that's his birth name, of the line of Shem, and he will make Abram the keeper of God's knowledge for generations to come. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, in your notes. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. For a first-time introduction to God's plan for him, that is a mouthful of information. Just the long-term implications of, I will bless nations that bless your descendants, Abraham, and I will curse those peoples and nations that curse your descendants, Abraham. That has extended through human history, and it will continue on into the millennium. And it's just, the impact of it is enormous. It's huge. So that powerful promise impacts nations to this day. In order that God might prepare Abraham for this great work as the keeper of his sacred laws, he was separating Abraham from his associations, from the society around him, from his family members, business associates, even though he would have grown up in a culture filled with paganism and superstition. Babylon was no purer than Babel was before God spread those people around the world. And yet, Abraham showed God something that he could work with. Something amazing. Still, God had to separate him. He says, move away from your father's house. Now, he took his father with him, Terah. Genesis 11, verse 31. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law, Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But they first stopped in Haran, and they stayed there. They dwelt there a while. And this is where Abram's father, Terah, died, and they would continue on their journey after that. But they stopped in Haran first. Matthew 19, verse 29. Here's a lesson. Christ's words would have the exact same conditions attached to Abram as they do for us who are called today. Let's read Matthew 19, verses 29 and 30. 29 and 30. It's an error in your notes. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first, meaning many who are last shall be first. So there's a lesson for us in this day of our calling, in this day and age. Well, now that Abram is separated apart from his culture and the associations and the people that were surrounding him, God is going to start training him for a much higher purpose. And he is still going to come into a very strange land with strange language and strange culture. He's going from Babylon to Canaan. It's like, God, you brought me into another place where there's wickedness everywhere, there's human sacrifice, there's people worshiping idols, and yet he remains focused and true to God's calling. He's got to be saying to himself, God, I don't know yet why you called me out of my home and family and environment, business associates, and bring me to this strange place that doesn't look like it's much better than where I came from. But he's faithful. Hebrews 11, verse 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of the place in which he would receive as an inheritance, which was Canaan. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with, or just like, it really means, just like Isaac and Jacob would dwell in tents after him. The heirs with him of the same promise. God extended the same promises from Abraham to Isaac and to Jacob for their descendants. We'll see the promises in a moment. Verse 10, for he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. God allowed Abraham to, in his mind's eye, see a vision of something that was going to be more permanent than living in a tent in a foreign land that he had traveled so far from, and he would never go back to Babylon again. It was Abraham's unquestioned obedience, which is one of the striking evidences of his faith, one of the most striking ones found in the entire Bible. Hebrews 11, verses 1 and 2 describe Abraham's faith. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. It's saying that faith is trust and hope in the invisible, leaning on and depending on God's absolutely reliable promises. If God promised it and we meet the requirements to have that promise, that blessing bestowed upon us, then there's nothing more certain in this world, in this universe, than God's promises. This fits Abraham very well. A complement to that verse is found, and it's in your notes, in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 through 18. Paul says, therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. What comfort that is. Let me just take a little aside and say the older we get, the more we say, oh yes, our outward man is perishing, but the inward man should be renewed day by day, and that should give us hope in the resurrection, hope in renewed bodies, hope in a perfect body that has no tiredness, no hunger, no fatigue, no aches, no pains, no suffering, no more crying, no more sorrow when that happens. Anyway, I just wanted to give you that aside for what it's worth. None of us is getting any younger. Oh, did I say that wrong? None of us is getting any younger. But I do only feel one more day older today. Verse 17, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. So you could see how God allowed Abraham, in his mind's eye, once again, to picture moving ahead into a different time when he didn't have to dwell in a tent for the rest of his life. We don't know, but down in Babylon, he might have lived in a beautiful palace. And Babylon at the time was in its glory. And here we see him dwelling with his community, his entourage of people, his servants. We'll talk about that again in a moment. But I mean, he brought a lot of people out of Babylon. And when he stopped in Haran, he gained more servants. And he had 318 able-bodied men who are trained for battle, and add all the children and wives and elderly people and whatever, and you might have had 1,000 people. This is a commentator's estimate. He might have had 1,000 people with him as he developed a community and settled in Canaan. And no doubt the other kings and the other rulers in the land of Canaan are watching, and of course he develops relationships with some of them, and they respect him and they honor him very highly. Abraham is a prince as he comes out, an extremely wealthy one at that. So he's relying on God's promises and for having vast numbers of descendants after him, and he's assured by the fulfillment of this promise. Otherwise, he would never have taken God up on such a strange request, where God was only giving him little bits of information along the way. He didn't map it all out for him. It says he went to a place he didn't know. He didn't know where he was going when God called him out of Babylon. He didn't know. God would only show him one step at a time, something for us to keep in mind in our lives too as we follow God. Sometimes he won't give us much of a map of the next 5, 10, 15 years in our lives, but he's given us a map to follow. So here's a lesson. Those whom God calls are tested in similar ways as Abraham was. Some here may have been tested in having to abandon jobs, careers that promised wealth and honor. We know a couple of ministers, my wife and I do, pastors who gave up illustrious athletic careers in baseball or other sports, basketball, who would have probably been stars had they continued on that path, and God had not called them and they had not accepted that call. Now, they don't have regrets, but they knew they had to do something major in their lives to follow God. You and I have probably had profitable associations to have to separate from, family members we've had to separate from, to enter what appeared to be a path at times of self-denial, hardship, and sacrifice. But God blessing us all along the way when we make these decisions to follow him. When God calls us to his service, he wants us to feel the need for his help and his guidance and depend on him so that he may reveal himself to us more fully with every passing year. God is watching always to see how we follow him. Genesis 12, verses 4 through 6. We skip over parts of the book that talk about, in Genesis, that talk about his stay in Haran and more steps on his way to Canaan. I'm jumping over these parts. Genesis 12, verses 4 through 6. So Abram departed as the Lord spoke to him. Lot also went with him, his nephew. Abram is about 75 years old. He's 75 years old when he departs from Haran now, or Haran. So he made a stop there. Now he's 75. He's on his way to Canaan. Genesis 13, verse 2. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. Verse 5, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. So his nephew is pretty wealthy and well off too, and he's got his servants and his family members as well. So a large contingent, again, some scholars think maybe 1,000 people were on this one journey from place to place. They'd set up camp and they'd have a community. And so they go to Shechem, about 40 miles north of what would later become Jerusalem. And they camp under the shade of the oaks of Moreh in a wide grassy valley. It's got olive groves. It's got gushing springs. It's between Mount Ebal on one side and Mount Gerizim on the other side. Moses would later, this is not in your notes, but Deuteronomy 8, verse 7, Moses describes this as a beautiful spot. A good land, a land of brooks and water, of fountains and springs that flow out of the valleys and hills. A land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. So Moses later, much later, describes this as a very fertile valley. Now, as they encamp, again, they're surrounded by Canaan influences. And he would find this strange culture all around him, rampant with idolatry. But still, whatever God had in mind for Abram, he clung to God's promises. And they pitched their tents. We recall the promises again while he was still in Ur of the Chaldeans. It's in your notes, Genesis 12, verse 2 and 3. I put this back in here to see what it was that God originally promised. I will make you a great nation, Abram. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Verses 7 through 9, God now adds another more specific promise. He says, when the Lord appears to him, he says, to your descendants, I will give this land. So he's in Canaan, and God says, I'm going to give you this land to your descendants, you and your descendants. Now, technically, Abraham in his lifetime didn't own that land. He had no deed to that land. So this had far, far-reaching impact on Abraham when he would be resurrected at Christ's return, and his descendants too. In James 2, verse 23, Abraham is called the friend of God. And so you could see how he would have a pattern in his life, a fine pattern of prayer, of communicating with God. So imagine with me, he's pitching his tent with his maybe 1,000 people, servants, and able-bodied men and women and children and so forth. He sets up an altar wherever he stops. This much is we're told. And it would be customary to hold a morning and evening sacrifice in those days. We're not told, but we're trying to picture not Abraham just going off by himself to sit by one of these altars made of stone, but taking large numbers of people to sit with him and him giving them instruction and perhaps praying together and teaching them God's laws, statutes, and judgments. Again, we're not told this, but as the tents were packed up to travel to whatever next stop God had in mind, those altars of stone would stay in those places, and they would be seen for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, Abraham is going to continue on a journey southward, and again, his faith would be tested. There was a severe drought in the land in Canaan, and the brooks ceased to flow. Flocks and herds were not going to have pasture land. Starvation threatened the whole encampment of his people. I could imagine Abraham praying and asking God for advice and wisdom and guidance on what to do next. And he's still in suspense as to what God has in store for him, but he decides to take his whole clan down to Egypt. We see that happening again in the days of Joseph and Jacob, when Joseph is in Egypt and Jacob and his family line of 70 people are going to face the same thing in Canaan. Decades later, there'd be a famine, and there would be starvation, and they would have to all go down to Egypt to find food. Well, let's go to Genesis 12, verse 10 in your notes. Genesis 12, verse 10, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarai, his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, this is what I predict. I threw that in there. This is what I think is going to happen. When the Egyptians see you, they're going to say, this is his wife, and they're going to kill me. But they'll let you live, Sarai. They're going to let you live. So let's do this. Please say that you're just my sister. Now, technically, she's a half-sister, not a full sister, but there's deception involved here. He says that it may be well with me for your sake and that I may live because of you. Now, I don't have time to go through it, but verses 14 through 20 talk about the issue that Pharaoh does get told by his servants about this beautiful Hebrew woman that comes into town with this big entourage of people. and she's summoned, and Pharaoh gets to see how beautiful she really is, and there's all this issue with Abram saying, "Oh, she's my sister," and you see that Pharaoh finds out that she's really his wife, and he's upset about this because there's plagues on his whole household, and God protects Abram and his whole family, but Pharaoh is really disappointed with him and says, "I'm going to have my servants escort you to the border of Egypt. We don't want you here anymore. Go back home. Leave. Get out of here." So Abram could have been a better light to those people at the time that he and his whole group were entering Egypt. But it was one of those tests that in this time frame, he didn't do so well in. He just didn't do that great in trusting God. He didn't trust God. And so God had, he protected Abram, but it could have gone better. Now let's continue. Here's a note that's not in your notes. Genesis 12, verse 11. The scenario I just briefly summarized for you, Abram made this claim to the Pharaoh of Egypt. We won't turn there, but in Genesis 20, verse 2, he does the same thing again, a second time. It says, now Abraham says of Sarah, his wife, "She's my sister." He says this to Abimelech, the king of Gerar, and he sent and took Sarah. This was the second time the same offense occurs. It was a distrust in God, and it was displeasing, but God worked with it. God always has workarounds, and no doubt Abram was humbled by the whole situation again. Here's a lesson for us. God well knew and orchestrated this trial for Abraham to teach him more lessons of submission, of patience, and of faith. Lessons that were to be placed on record for the benefit to all of us who would be called and who would have to face some hardships because of our calling. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, in your notes, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. God has always tried his people in the furnace of affliction, sometimes more than others. Sometimes God gives us rest and peace. Sometimes God introduces a new test in our lives. It broadsides us. It comes from behind. We didn't see it coming. Sometimes those tests can last for days, weeks, months, or years, sometimes decades. This is where the dross is separated from the pure, refined gold God talks about in Christian character. God looks for some talent or temperament in each one of us and can tailor-make our tests just for us, just for you and me. And this is all to advance us in his work, in his wisdom, and in his love for us. He does this out of love. He can bring us into situations that test our character. He can reveal weaknesses that have been hidden from even our own knowledge. Again, he does this refining for us for eternity, and he does it out of love for us. He gives us opportunities to correct our weaknesses to better fit us for his service in this life. He teaches us to lean on him as our primary help and safeguard in an evil world. And that will conclude this first of 4 segments. Again, next time we'll talk about between Canaan and Melchizedek. With that, I'll ask our song.